evening, good vach, Shavua Tov. We are coming out of Shabbos and bringing every week we take the energy and the blessings of Shabbos into the coming week. Every week is energized by the Shabbos that comes before it. And what a beautiful Shabbos this was. At our shul, we got unconfirmed report during the morning. I mean, we're all, Orthodox Jews don't turn on TVs and radios, but somebody heard somewhere that some hostages had been freed. And we came out of Shabbos and learned the wonderful news that 4 hostages had been freed in a very difficult military operation. Thank God they're home. Thank you, God, so much. I believe that the woman who was rescued, her mom, very ill, and it was just her fervent prayer that she would see her daughter, and she has, and she will, and thank you, God, so much, and may all the hostages be freed, and may Hamas, this evil force that terrorizes and destroys and sacrifices and kills their own people, let alone what they do to Israel, may they be destroyed, and may it be soon. And we say amen. Thank God. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Saturday night? My gosh, we're just about there, right? This Shabbos started 7:44. I think June 28th is the very latest Shabbos that here in LA begins at 7:50. So 6 minutes from the latest that it can be at this time of year. And you guys on the East Coast, my hat's off to you. I tip my hat to you. Incredible. I mean, what is it? I mean, at 12:50 in the morning, a.m. on a Saturday night, you're learning Torah. There's a big reward for you. What a zechus, what a merit. Sharon in New Jersey, Lucy in Minnesota, Joe in the Inland Empire. May the rescued hostages have a refuah shleima and the others join them soon. Amen. Bill, can't stay all session. Don't blame you, my holy brother. Celeste in Boulder, Colorado. Randy in Florida. Incredible East Coast dedication. Ilani in Silver Spring, Maryland. Marie in Freeport, New York. I am in awe. I won't waste your time. Let's be efficient. We have a beautiful round number. Our daf today is page 100 here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. And with page 100, we open Mishna number 4 here in chapter 8 with regard to one who exchanges a cow for a donkey, such that by virtue of the cow owner's act of acquisition on the donkey's erstwhile owner simultaneously acquires the cow wherever it happens to be located, right? So we're going to trade a donkey for a cow. You and I are standing, I have a donkey, you have a cow. So I'm going to give you my donkey, you're going to give me your cow. You and I are standing where the donkey is. The cow is somewhere else, maybe in another county. So, but the deal is donkey for the cow. So unlike money, where if I'm buying the cow from you, when I give you money, I haven't acquired the cow yet. But since it's merchandise for merchandise, right, an object for an object, so when I give you the donkey, right, and you acquire the donkey, you pull the donkey, that's going to be the formal act of acquisition. So at that moment, I acquire the cow, even though the cow's not here. I acquire the cow, which is in that other county. Why does it matter? Because we know when when you acquired the donkey from me, but at the time the cow was pregnant and the cow gives birth to a calf. But what you don't know is, was the calf born before I acquired the cow, which would mean the calf is yours, or after I acquired the cow, which would mean the calf is mine, right? That's the question that's going to be the relevant question here. And afterward, the cow is found to have calved, nice word, given birth to a calf. And similarly, with regard to one who sells his Canaanite female slave with the acquisition effected by the buyer giving him money, and afterwards she is found to have given birth to a child who will be a slave belonging to the mother's master. Thank God slavery is gone from this world. We can see how terrible it was, the way it would break up a mother and a child. But at any rate, in terms of actual ownership, maybe the owners would decide to keep the mother with the child, but they would have to do another transaction for that. And afterwards, she's found to have given birth to a child who will be a slave belonging to his mother's master, depending on when the birth happened. So at times, it is uncertain whether the offspring was born before or after the transaction. So if the seller says, the birth occurred before I sold the cow or the female slave, and so the offspring belongs to me. And the buyer says, the birth occurred after I purchased the cow or the maidservant, and so the offspring belongs to me. So in that case, where both are sure that they own the offspring, then they divide the value of the offspring between them. Right? So that's the operative thing here. They're both making a claim of certainty. All of what we're going to be talking about tonight is the differences between certain claims and uncertain claims. And that doesn't mean that everyone knows for sure or there'd be no argument. What it means is that the two parties who are arguing are both sure of their position, as opposed to where one says, I don't know, and the other one says, I do know, right? And that would be a different outcome. Now the Mishnah continues, there is a case of one who had two Canaanite slaves, one large, who was worth more on the slave market, and one small, worth less on the slave market. And similarly, one who had two fields, one large and one small. And he sold one of them, and there was a dispute between the buyer and the seller concerning which one was sold. So if the buyer says, I purchased the large one, and the other one, meaning the seller, says, I do not know which I sold. So here the buyer is entitled to take the large one because this is a certain claim versus an uncertain claim. And if the seller says, I sold the small one, and the other one, i.e. the buyer, says, I do not know which one I purchased, so then the buyer is entitled to take only the small one. Now, if this one says the large one was sold, and that one says the small one was sold, so now we have two claims that are, both people are certain of their position, then the seller takes an oath that it was the small one that he sold, and then the buyer takes the small one. So now we've introduced the oath, which we didn't talk about in terms of the, because when they didn't, no one knew for sure, well, they both made claims about that the calf had been sold. I mean, that when the calf was born, right? We didn't say anything about swearing oaths. But here, where both, there was a large one and a small one sold, a more valuable and a less valuable one sold, and the purchaser is saying what I bought was the more valuable one, and the seller is saying what I sold was the less valuable one, and they're both certain of their position. Now we introduce that which one takes the oath? That the seller takes an oath that it was the small one that he sold, and then the buyer has to accept that and take the small one. And finally, if this one says, I do not know which one was sold, and that one says, I do not know which one was sold, they divide the disputed amount between them. And that's the Mishnah. So in one case we had an oath, in one case we didn't have an oath, and we saw that there was differences when they're both certain of their position and where one is certain and the other one is uncertain, or where both are uncertain. Now, the Gemara. The Gemara asks, in the first clause of the Mishnah, why do the two parties divide the value of the offspring between them? Instead, let us see in whose domain the offspring currently is. So that person has presumptive ownership. That person... Sorry, I got distracted. Something going on outside. That person has presumptive ownership of the offspring, and the other person will be considered to be the one who is exacting property from another. And accordingly, the burden of proof rests upon him. Since he cannot prove his claim, he is not entitled to take the offspring. I mean, right? Most likely, when we traded, I give you a donkey, you give me a cow, we are standing where the donkey is. The cow is somewhere else, and we're not sure when it gave birth to a calf, whether it was before you took possession of the donkey or after, meaning at that moment is when I took possession of the cow, but we don't know when the calf was born. Well, probably, right, probably you're over at my house where you're taking possession of the donkey, and the cow is at your house. So if the cow and the calf are at your house, and my claim is that the calf was born after I took possession of the cow, but the cow and the calf are at your house, presumably I would have to prove that that's what happened, and otherwise the calf is going to remain with you. We both agree that I get the cow, but since I can't prove that the calf was born after the exchange happened, I'm not going to be able to get the calf, right? That's what's being argued right now. And the Gemara answers that Rabbi Chia bar Avin says that Shmuel says the Mishnah is referring to a different case. It's a case where the calf is standing in the marsh. It's not on your property. It's not on my property. It's in property that doesn't belong to either one of us. And with regard to the case of the female slave, also, this is a case where the baby that she had is found in an alley which does not belong to either the buyer or the seller. Again, we're making a strong hypothetical case just to test the law. Most likely a baby wouldn't end up in an alley like that, but in case it did, then what would we do? So the Gemara asks further, but even if the offspring is not in either party's domain, establish it to be in the presumptive ownership of its original owner, meaning the seller, as he certainly owned the offspring when it was still a fetus. And so the other person will be considered to be the one who is exacting property from another, and accordingly the burden of proof rests on him, and since he cannot prove his claim, he should not be entitled to take the offspring. And the Gemara answers, in accordance with whose opinion is the ruling of this Mishnah, that the parties divide the value of the offspring equally. It is in accordance with the opinion of Sumakos. We're going to keep coming back to this. It is in accordance with the opinion of Sumakos, who says, when there is property of uncertain ownership, the parties divide it equally without the need to take an oath. Now that's interesting that we're applying Sumakos' principle that when two people have an uncertain claim to property, that they divide the value. Weren't we talking about a case where we're both saying with certainty that no, I say the offspring was born after the transaction, you're saying the offspring was born before the transaction, and we're both sure of ourselves, and yet the Mishnah said we divide the value of that offspring. And now we're applying Sumakos' principle, but he spoke where there was uncertain claim. So what's going on? And the Gemara challenges this. We'll say that Sumakos says his ruling when there is a conflict between an uncertain claim and an uncertain claim, as each party admits that his claim to the property is uncertain. But did he say his ruling when there is a conflict between a certain claim and a certain claim, right? The two people are sure of themselves, as each party in our Mishnah claims to be certain that the property belongs to him. And the Gemara offers two opinions concerning the ruling of Sumakos. Rabba bar Rav Huna says, yes, Sumakos says his ruling even when there is a conflict between a certain claim and a certain claim. I don't like the word certain in this way, right? A claim that is certain versus another claim that is certain. And another opinion, Rava said, actually, when Sumakos said his ruling, it applies only when there is a conflict between an uncertain claim and an uncertain claim. But when there is a conflict between two people who are sure of themselves, he did not say his ruling. And in order that the Mishnah not pose a difficulty, amend it to refer to uncertain claims and teach, this seller says, perhaps the birth occurred before I sold the cow or the female slave, and the buyer says, perhaps the birth occurred after I purchased the cow or the maidservant. Then we can see why Sumakos applies. The Gemara challenges Rabba bar Rav Huna's opinion. We learned in the Mishnah, if this one says, I don't know which one was sold, and that one says, I don't know which one was sold, in the case of the big and the small, they divide the disputed amount between them. That's Sumakos, because we have two uncertain claims, and we say they divide it. Okay, that makes sense. So why would the first clause of the Mishnah talk about them being certain and they divide? So granted, according to the opinion of Rava, From the fact that the last clause of the Mishnah is referring to a case where there is a conflict between an uncertain claim and an uncertain claim, one can say that the first clause as well is referring to a case in which there is a conflict between an uncertain claim and an uncertain claim. But according to the opinion of Rabba bar Rav Huna, who said, yes, Sumakos says his ruling even when there is a conflict between a certain and a certain claim, there is the following difficulty. Now that the Mishnah teaches that even when there is a conflict between a certain and a certain claim, Sumakos says that the parties divide the disputed amount between them. Is it necessary for the Mishnah to state that when there is a conflict between an uncertain claim and an uncertain claim, that the parties divide the disputed amount between them? It wouldn't be necessary to say that. And the Mishnah does say that. So indicating that, well, the first clause must be about certain versus certain. And are we applying Sumakos? I mean, Rava would, but Rabba bar Rav Huna would not. So the Gemara rejects the question. If the difficulty is due only to that reason, there is no conclusive argument. One can say that the Mishnah taught the latter clause to shed light on the first clause, so that you will not say that the ruling in the first clause applies only when there is a conflict between an uncertain claim and an uncertain claim. But where there is a conflict between a certain claim and a certain claim, the ruling in the first clause does not apply, and the disputed amount is not divided. And to dispel that possibility, the Mishnah teaches the last clause, which is referring to a conflict between an uncertain claim and an uncertain claim. And then by inference, the first clause must refer to a case where there is a conflict between a certain claim and a certain claim. And nevertheless, the parties do divide the disputed amount between them. So the Gemara again challenges Rabba bar Rav Huna's opinion. We learned in the Mishnah, if this one says the large one was sold and that one says the small one was sold, so that's a certain claim versus a certain claim, then the seller takes an oath that it was the small one that he sold, and then the buyer takes the small one. So that's the outcome of certain versus certain, an oath. Granted, according to the opinion of Rava, who said that when Sumakos says his ruling, it applies only when there is a conflict between uncertain and uncertain, but when there is a conflict between certain and certain, he did not say his ruling. And it is due to that reason that in the clause in the Mishnah in which each party offers a claim with certainty, that the seller takes an oath. But according to the opinion of Rabba bar Rav Huna, who said that Sumakos says his ruling even when it's certain versus certain, why does the Mishnah rule that the seller takes an oath? The Mishnah should have ruled that they divide the disputed amount between them according to Sumakos. And the Gemara answers that Sumakos concedes that where there is a requirement for one of the parties to take an oath, required by Torah law, the disputed amount is not divided, as we will need to say below to resolve another challenge to Sumakos' opinion. We're going to continue, but basically, when are you forced to take an oath? When you have partial admission, right? I admit that I bought a slave from you, but I deny that the slave I bought was the small one. I claim that I bought the big one, right? And the seller would say, I admit that I sold you a slave, but I deny that I sold you the big one. I sold you the small one. So here, because the one who's seeking to extract property is the buyer, I think it's the seller who's forced to swear the oath, and then he only has to give up the small one. Case of partial admission is where we go to an oath. Now, the Mishnah teaches, in the case of one who had two Canaanite slaves, one large and one small, the seller, and each claims, right, the seller claims that he sold the small one, the buyer claims that he bought the big one. This is where the seller takes an oath that it was the small one that he sold, and then the buyer takes the small one. So the Gemara asks, why does the seller take an oath? An oath is required only when a defendant admits to part of the claim made against him. But in this case, that which the buyer claimed from the seller, i.e. the large slave, the seller doesn't admit to at all. And that which the seller admits to, i.e. the smaller slave, the buyer has not claimed from him. So why are you saying partial admission? There is no partial admission. And furthermore, with regard to the small slave, this is a case of, here you are. The seller is not merely admitting that he is liable to give the slave in the future, but allows the buyer to take possession of the slave immediately, the small one. As Rav Sheshis explains on page 6a, one who offers the disputed item immediately is not considered to be one who admits to part of a claim, and therefore he is exempt by Torah law from taking an oath, but not by rabbinic law. And furthermore, one does not take an oath concerning a claim about slaves, but only concerning claims about movable property, right? That there, a slave is not like livestock. For these three reasons, there should be no requirement to take an oath in the case of one who sold a slave to another, and one claims what you sold was the big one, and the other claims what I sold was the small one. And Rav said the Mishnah is referring to a case where the buyer claims money from the seller, not a slave or a field. The buyer claims that he gave the seller money equivalent to the value of a large slave, and the seller admits to having received money equal to the value of a small slave. And in the case of the field, the buyer claims that he gave the seller money equal to the value of a large field, and the seller admits to having received money equal to the value of a small field. So there is partial admission. And Shmuel said the Mishnah is referring to a case where the buyer claims that he purchased a garment of a large slave, and the seller admits to having sold him a garment of a small slave. And in the case of the field, the buyer claims he purchased the sheaves yielded by a large field, and the seller admits to having sold him the sheaves yielded by a small field, not the land, but its produce. Now we're on page 100b. And the Gemara challenges Shmuel's interpretation. If the dispute is over which size garment was sold, the seller should not be required to take an oath. Is that which the buyer claimed from him, the seller did not admit to at all, and that which the seller admitted to, the buyer has not claimed from him. It's not saying you owe me $100 and you say, no, I owe you $50. So I owe you part of what you are claiming from me. That's the partial admission, and you would swear an oath that you don't owe the other half, and then I only get the part that you admit. But here, you're saying, Sal, I sold you a red car, and I'm saying, no, you sold me a blue car. Or you're saying, I sold you that red car, and I'm saying, no, you sold me that blue car. There's no partial admission. Our dispute is total, right? I'm saying you sold me that car. You're saying I sold you that car. Now, what we could say is, well, he admits that, we both admit that there was a sale of a car. We're just arguing which car. So is that a partial admission or not? We haven't established this. Right? That which the buyer claimed for him, the seller did not admit to, and that which the seller admitted to, the buyer has not claimed. So the Gemara answers, Shmuel was referring to a case like that which Rav Papa said. The dispute is with regard to a garment that was formed from several pieces of cloth that were attached together. So here too, the dispute is with regard to a garment that was formed from several pieces of cloth that were attached together. And the disagreement was about how much of that garment was actually sold. Or think of it another way, that it's a bolt of cloth. I say I bought a certain amount of cloth from you, and you're saying you bought less than you thought, right? So you admit, or we both agree that a certain amount of cloth was sold, and we're arguing about the remainder of the same kind of thing. We're only arguing about amount, not the one. I just want to make sure I'm in the right place. And Rav was about how much, right? So Rabbi Hoshaya found Shmuel's interpretation difficult. Does the Mishnah teach a garment? Why are you talking about a garment? The Mishnah that we're talking about, Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 8, teaches a slave. How can Shmuel claim that the dispute was about a garment? So rather, Rabbi Hoshaya said the Mishnah is referring to a case where the buyer claimed a large slave along with his garment, or where he claimed a large field along with its sheaves. Since the seller admits to part of the claim about the garment or sheaves, he is required to take an oath about them. Once he is required to take that oath, it can be extended, right? We've talked about extending an oath. Once you admit to something, you can extend the oath to some other part of the transaction. It can be extended to require him to take an oath even concerning the claim about the slave or the field itself. Normally, slaves in fields are not subject to oaths about partial admission, but when that deal was coupled with a movable property, and there's a dispute about that, we can extend the oath to the field or the slave. And the Gemara asks, but still, the dispute over which type of garment was sold, that which the buyer claimed from him, the seller did not admit, and that which the seller admitted, the buyer did not claim. So the Gemara answers, Rav Papa said the dispute is with regard to a garment that was formed from several pieces of cloth that were attached together, and the dispute concerns how much of the garment was actually sold, like the bolt of cloth. Rav Sheshes found Rabbi Hoshaya's interpretation difficult. Does the Mishnah come only to teach us the law of binding? But we already learned that halacha in a Mishnah, Tractate Kedushin 26a. Generally, one is not obligated to take an oath concerning the denial of a claim with regard to land. In a legal dispute involving both land and movable property, if the defendant admits to part of the claim with regard to the movable property, thereby rendering himself obligated to take an oath, denying any responsibility for the remaining movable property, the movable property binds the real property that serves as a guarantee, i.e. the land, so that he is forced to take an oath concerning the land as well, extending the oath from the movable property, some of which is under dispute, to the real property that would normally not be subject to an oath. So rather, Rav Sheshes said, in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah, it is Rabbi Meir, who said the legal status of a slave is like that of movable property. Even if the dispute is over the slave alone, the seller can be required to take an oath. That's the minority opinion of Rabbi Meir, that a slave is compared to movable property, but the majority opinion is that slaves are compared to real property, to land. The Gemara asks, but still, if the dispute is over which slave was sold, the big one or the small one, the big one being more valuable, then that which the buyer claimed from him, the seller did not admit, and that which the seller admitted, the buyer has not claimed. And the seller should not therefore be required to take an oath. And the Gemara answers, the Tan of the Mishnah holds, in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Gamliel, as we learned in a Mishnah, Tractate Shavuos 38b, if one claimed wheat from another, and the defendant admitted only to owing him barley, those are different things, the defendant is exempt from having to take an oath. But Rabban Gamliel deems him liable because wheat and barley are different things, but presumably they're both kinds of grain, and therefore we can think of this as partial admission. The Gemara asks, still with regard to the small slave, this is a case of, here you are, as the slave is immediately available to be taken. The small slave is not considered part of the buyer's claim, as his claim is limited to the difference between the values of the slaves, and that amount is being entirely denied. Consequently, there should be no requirement to take an oath. And to resolve this difficulty, Rava said, in the case of the slave, the Mishnah is referring to a case where, after the sale, the seller severed the slave's hand, and in the case of the field, it is a case where after the sale, the seller dug pits, ditches, and caves in it, and therefore he cannot say, here you are, right? Meaning that either the land or the slave has been irreversibly damaged, and that's why you can't say just take it back. The Gemara offers another challenge to Rav Sheshes' interpretation, but didn't Rabbi Meir teach us the opposite, as we learned in a Mishna in Bava 96b? If one robbed another of an animal and it aged and declined in value while it was in his possession, right, in the robber's possession. Or if one robbed another of Canaanite slaves and they aged, since they are no longer in the condition that they were in when the robber took them, he cannot return them in their current state to his victim. Rather, he pays according to the value at the time of the robbery. And Rabbi Meir says, with regard to slaves, he says to the victim, that which is yours is before you, and no compensation is required. Apparently, Rabbi Meir holds that the legal status of a slave is like that of land, and not, as Rav Sheshes said, like that of movable property, because the land or the slave, would have changed over time, no matter who was in possession of it. And the Gemara answers, that is not difficult. Rav Sheshes apparently holds, like Rabba bar Abu, who reverses the attribution of the opinions in that Mishnah and teaches Rabbi Meir says he pays according to the value at the time of the robbery. And the rabbis say, with regard to slaves, he says to the victim, that which is yours is before you, and he doesn't have to pay compensation for having, held the slave in his possession while the slave got older. He just returns the slave. So since Rav Sheshes interprets the Mishnah as referring to a case where the dispute is over the slave alone, and interprets it to be in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, he apparently also assumes that Rabbi Meir holds that an oath is taken even with regard to a claim of land, as his explanation would need to account for the case in the Mishnah concerning a dispute over the small or the large field. And the Gemara questions this assumption. But given that Rabbi Meir said only that the legal status of a slave is like that of movable property, from where does Rav Sheshes learn that Rabbi Meir holds that we compare land to a slave, so that just as for a claim about a slave an oath is taken, so too for a claim about land an oath is taken? Perhaps Rabbi Meir holds that an oath is taken only on a claim about a slave, but not on a claim about land. And the Gemara answers, it should not enter your mind that Rabbi Meir makes a distinction between slaves and land in this regard, as it is taught in a baraisa, with regard to one who exchanges a cow for a donkey, such that by virtue of the cow owner's act of acquisition on the donkey's erstwhile owner simultaneously acquires the cow wherever it happens to be located, and afterward the cow is found to have had a calf. And similarly with regard to one who sells his Canaanite maidservant with the acquisition effected by the buyer giving him money, and afterward she is found to have given birth to a child who will be a slave belonging to his mother's master, at times it is uncertain whether the offspring was born before or after the transaction. Now, this is exactly the case of our Mishnah, but we're talking about a baraisa. So let's see how the baraisa resolves it. If this seller says the birth occurred while the cow or the maidservant was still in my possession, and that buyer remains silent, here's the difference between this and our Mishnah, then the seller is entitled to take the offspring. Now, if this one says, I don't know what happened, and that one says, I don't know what happened, they divide the value of the offspring between them. If the seller says, the birth occurred while the cow or the slave was still in my possession, and the buyer says the birth occurred after the cow or the maidservant was already in my possession, now they're both expressing certain claims, then the seller takes an oath stating that the cow or maidservant gave birth in his possession. He is then entitled to take the offspring. And this is because for anyone who takes an oath required by Torah law, he takes the oath and does not have to pay. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir, minority opinion, and the rabbis say one does not take an oath, not on a claim concerning slaves and not on a claim concerning land, and perhaps that's why in our Mishnah they split the value. And the Gemara rejects this inference. But from where is this inferred? Perhaps the rabbis are speaking to him utilizing the style of just as. And what they're saying is like this: just as you concede to us with regard to land, concede to us also with regard to slaves. And the Gemara adds, no, that Rabbi Meir holds that one does not take an oath for a claim concerning land. As we learned in a Mishnah in Tractate Shavuot 42b, Rabbi Meir says there are some matters that have a legal status like that of land, but nevertheless, with regard to oaths, they are not treated like land, and so one takes an oath regarding to them. But the rabbis do not concede to Rabbi Meir that this is the law. How so? If one claims, I delivered 10 vines laden with grapes to you, and the other one says there were only 5. So Rabbi Meir deems him liable to take an oath of one who admits to part of a claim. But the rabbis say anything that is attached to the ground has the legal status like that of land, and so we don't do an oath of partial admission for it. So the Gemara clarifies the scope of their dispute. And Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina says, the difference between Rabbi Meir and the sage and the rabbis is only in a case of grapes that are ready to be picked. As one sage, Rabbi Meir, holds they are considered as though they have already been harvested, meaning that they are regarded as movable property, with regard to which an oath would be taken. And the other sage, meaning the rabbis, the majority, holds they are not considered as though they were about to be picked, meaning that they are regarded as land, and with regard to which oaths are not taken. And evidently, Rabbi Meir agrees that an oath is not taken concerning land. He would only say that in this case, the grapes that are ready to be picked, we consider them like movable property, but he doesn't concede that you take, but he doesn't agree. I mean, he agrees with the rabbis that we don't take oaths with respect to land. So rather, actually, the Mishnah can be explained only in accordance with the interpretation of Rabbi Hoshaya that was cited above. And with regard to that which posed a difficulty for you, namely that according to this explanation, the novelty of the Mishnah is only that movable property binds land so that one can be required to take an oath with regard to it, but otherwise we wouldn't. And the law is already taught in the Mishnah and Tractate Kiddushin, one can explain that it was necessary to also teach this in the Mishnah here, because it might enter your mind to say that the garment of a slave is like the slave himself, or that the sheaves of a field are like the field itself. If so, there would be no basis to require an oath, because there wouldn't be any movable property involved, even if one based on the claims about the garment and the sheaves themselves. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us that they are considered distinct items, and the claims concerning them require the seller to take an oath, which can then be extended to require an oath for the claim concerning the slave or the land. I am almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. So the Gemara analyzes one of the clauses of the Baraisa that was cited above. In a case in which it is unclear when the cow or the maidservant gave birth, if this one says, I don't know, and the other one says, I don't know, they divide the value between them. And the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion is this? Well, it is obviously in accordance with the opinion of Sumakos, who says, when there is property of uncertain ownership, the parties divide it equally between them. But the Gemara questions this attribution. If so, say and try to explain accordingly the latter clause of the same Baraisa. If this seller says the birth occurred while the cow or maidservant was still in my possession, and that buyer says the birth occurred after it was in my possession, each has a certain claim that the birth happened either before the sale or after the sale, then the seller takes an oath stating that it gave birth while it was still in his possession, and then he keeps the offspring. And the Gemara explains the difficulty. But according to the opinion of Rabba bar Rav Huna, who says, yes, Sumakos said his ruling, even in a case in which there is a conflict between a certain claim and a certain claim, why does the Mishnah rule that the seller takes an oath? The Mishnah should have ruled that they divide the value of the disputed offspring between them. And the Gemara answers, Sumakos concedes that where there is a requirement for one of the parties to take an oath by Torah law, then the disputed amount is not divided. And furthermore, this is not a case in which the seller could say, here you are, because the case is where, after the sale, the seller damaged the slave's hand, just like the explanation of Rava above. So you can't just take what was yours, it has been damaged and we have to work it out. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 4. And God willing, we'll open Mishnah number 5 on page 1, well, at the end of page 100, but our daf being 101, tomorrow at the regular Sunday time, 6 p.m. Pacific. One question from Ilanit. Sal, your energy is very much appreciated. Such a blessing. You give such a good example. Thank you for your faithfulness and true love of Torah. Oh, thank you so much. You are so sweet. I am totally inspired by my students to stand and deliver each night, even when I might not feel like it. Very quick, I had a wonderful discussion that I found really productive for me at Shul today. There's a principle, right, that you should serve God with all of yourself. All of yourself. And that means, obviously, we serve God with our Yetzer Tov, our good inclination. But we all have an evil inclination, a Yetzer Hara, that incites us to sin, give into our impulses, and just do what we want to do, even if we know that it is wrong, right? That our Yetzer Hara is always tempting us to do the wrong thing. So how do you serve God with your Yetzer Hara? How do you serve God with your evil inclination? How do you bring your evil inclination? One way is, well, whatever your evil inclination wants you to do, boom, like that. Okay, thank you for putting before me what the wrong thing to do is. Now now I have a chance to overcome it, right? And if we get into the habit of like the Yetzer Hara presenting that choice, and we say, no, I'm not going to do that, then it becomes like batting practice, But if we keep giving in to the Yetzer Hara, then it becomes like, a pitcher with a 100-mile-an-hour fastball that we can never hit it, right? And a different way to think about it that Rabbi Meni Chazanov told me is that, for example, when you're praying and you get distracted, right? And so often, I struggle with this all the time. I'm trying to recite my prayers, and my mind just goes somewhere else. So he brought down, I think from the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, that thought that appeared in your mind when you were trying to pray faithfully, make that your tefillah, right? And whatever that thought that came in to distract you, once you realize that you've been distracted, it's like, well, this is a thing that needs to be addressed. How can you turn that into a prayer? And he said that, and then tonight, in the evening prayers at the end of Shabbos, it happened to me. A thought came up that distracted me. I said, how can I make that my prayer? And it actually became very powerful immediately, and it was very helpful to me. So I hope that's helpful to you. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers, and a good vok, Shavua Tov. May we have a great week, and may the energy of this Shabbos carry us into Shavuos, which begins Tuesday night. The gift of Torah. This is such an elevated, amazing week in which we're celebrating the giving of Torah. We can celebrate the receiving of Torah every day of our lives, but this week we'll celebrate the gift of Torah from God. And what a gift that we came out of Shabbos and learned that 4 of the hostages had been freed. Please God, may all of the hostages be brought home safely that are still in captivity. And we say Amen and good vibes.